The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Lieutenant Sarah Chen walked toward the administration building. Her steps were careful, measured, though she tried to hide the slight limp that had developed over the past 3 weeks. The heavy winter coat she wore seemed too big for her small frame, hanging loose around her shoulders despite the cold February air. Commander Roberts stood at his office window, watching the soldiers conduct their morning drills in the courtyard, below. At 52, he had seen every excuse imaginable from his subordinates. 28 years in the Army had taught him to spot weakness, deception, and those who tried to take advantage of the system. When his secretary knocked and announced that Lieutenant Chen was here for their scheduled meeting, he didn't turn around immediately. Sarah entered the office and stood at attention, her coat still buttoned up to her neck. The commander finally turned, his steel-gray eyes scanning her appearance with obvious disapproval. Her uniform was pristine as always, but something seemed different. Her usually bright demeanor appeared dulled, and there were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. "Lieutenant Chen," Commander Roberts began, settling into his chair behind the imposing oak desk. "Your performance reports have been concerning lately. Your training scores have dropped significantly, and you've been missing mandatory physical training sessions. Your squad leader reports that you seem distracted and unfocused during operations." Sarah kept her eyes fixed on a point above the commander's head, maintaining military protocol. "Sir, I understand your concerns, and I take full responsibility for any shortcomings in my performance." The commander leaned back in his chair, his expression growing more stern. "That's not what I'm looking for, Lieutenant. I need explanations, not empty acknowledgments. You've been one of our most promising officers for the past 2 years. Your tactical skills and leadership abilities were exceptional. Now, suddenly, you're performing like a new recruit." A muscle in Sarah's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. She had practiced this conversation in her mind dozens of times, but standing here now, facing the man who had once praised her as officer material, she felt the weight of disappointment crushing down on her shoulders. "Sir, I've been dealing with some personal challenges that have affected my focus," she said carefully. "I'm working to resolve them and get back to my previous performance level." Commander Roberts slammed his palm down on the desk, causing Sarah to flinch slightly. "Personal challenges? Lieutenant, when you put on this uniform, your personal life becomes secondary to your duty to this country and your fellow soldiers. We all have personal challenges. The difference is that some of us know how to compartmentalize and maintain our professional standards." Sarah's hands, clasped behind her back, were trembling now. She could feel sweat forming despite the air conditioning in the office. The commander's words echoed similar sentiments she had heard from others recently, that she was making excuses, that she wasn't tough enough, that maybe she wasn't cut out for military life after all. "Furthermore," the commander continued, his voice rising, "I've received reports that you've been seen at the base medical facility multiple times in recent weeks. Are you trying to build a case for some kind of medical discharge? Because if that's your game plan, Lieutenant, you're going about it the wrong way." The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her breathing became shallow, and for a moment she thought she might collapse right there in the commander's office. The medical visits, they had been necessary, but she had hoped they would remain private. Now it seemed like everyone was watching, her judging her, assuming the worst about her motivations. "Sir, that's not—" she began, but the commander cut her off with a wave of his hand. "I don't want to hear any more excuses, Chen. You have 2 choices here. Either you pull yourself together and start performing like the officer you're supposed to be, or I'll have no choice but to recommend you for immediate reassignment to a position where your personal problems won't endanger other soldiers." Sarah felt the room spinning slightly. The fluorescent light seemed too bright, and the commander's voice sounded like it was coming from far away. She had been dreading this conversation for weeks, knowing that her declining performance wouldn't go unnoticed forever, but she had hoped somehow that she could find a way to explain without having to reveal everything. The commander stood up and walked around his desk, stopping directly in front of her. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, Lieutenant." Sarah reluctantly met his gaze. She could see the frustration and disappointment in his eyes, but also something else, a complete lack of understanding or compassion. To him, she was just another soldier who couldn't handle the pressure, Another disappointment in a career filled with people who had let him down. "I've been in the army longer than you've been alive," he said, his voice low and measured. "I've seen combat in 3 different conflicts, lost friends, been away from my family for months at a time. Every soldier in this building has faced adversity and personal challenges. What makes you think you're special? What makes you think you deserve special consideration?" The word stung because Sarah had once asked herself the same questions. She had joined the military because she wanted to serve, to be part of something bigger than herself. She had worked twice as hard as her male counterparts to prove herself, had excelled in every training program, had earned the respect of her peers and superiors through dedication and skill. But now, standing in this office, she felt like all of that meant nothing. The commander saw her as weak, as someone making excuses, as a liability to the unit. The worst part was that a small voice in her head wondered if he might be right. "I expect a significant improvement in your performance within the next 30 days, Commander Roberts said, returning to his seat. "If I don't see substantial progress, I'll have no choice but to take administrative action. This meeting is your official warning, Lieutenant. Don't waste this opportunity." Sarah nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir, I understand completely." As she turned to leave, the commander added one final comment that made her stomach drop. "And Chen, whatever games you think you're playing with these medical visits and this sudden decline in performance, remember that there are real soldiers depending on you. Don't let your personal drama put lives at risk." Sarah walked out of the office with as much dignity as she could muster, but inside, she was crumbling. The commander's words followed her down the hallway, each one a reminder of how alone she truly was in this situation. The days following her meeting with Commander Roberts blurred together in a haze of forced normalcy and hidden pain. Sarah pushed herself harder than ever, arriving at the base before dawn and staying late into the evening. She volunteered for extra duties, threw herself into paperwork, and tried desperately to prove that she wasn't the weak soldier the commander believed her to be. But her body had other plans. Each morning brought new challenges as she struggled to get dressed in her small apartment off base. The simple act of buttoning her uniform shirt had become an ordeal that left her breathless and shaking. She had developed a careful routine of timing her pain medication so that she could function during the most critical parts of her day, but the windows of relief were getting shorter. Sergeant Mike Torres, her closest friend on the base, had started noticing the changes in her behavior. They had gone through officer training together 3 years ago, and he knew her well enough to sense when something was seriously wrong. Sarah had always been the type to push through difficulties with determination and humor, but lately she seemed to be running on nothing but willpower and stubbornness. "Chen, you look like hell," Torres said as they sat in the mess hall during lunch. "When's the last time you actually slept through the night?" Sarah picked at her food, barely eating despite having skipped breakfast again. "I'm fine, Torres. Just dealing with some stress from the commander breathing down my neck." Torres leaned forward, lowering his voice. "This isn't about Roberts and his attitude problem. You've been different for weeks now. You barely eat. You're always wearing that heavy coat even indoors. And yesterday I saw you struggling to carry a box that would normally be nothing for you." The observation made Sarah's chest tighten with anxiety. If Torres was noticing these things, others probably were too. She had been so focused on hiding the most obvious signs of her condition that she hadn't realized how many smaller details were giving her away. "Look," Torres continued, "whatever's going on, you know you can talk to me, right? We've been through too much together for you to shut me out now." Sarah wanted desperately to tell him everything. Torres was one of the few people on the base who had never treated her differently because she was a woman. He respected her abilities, and had always been someone she could count on for honest advice. But the words stuck in her throat, trapped by fear and shame. "It's complicated," she finally said. "I wish I could explain, but it's not something I can just talk about casually." That afternoon, Sarah was assigned to lead a training exercise with a group of new recruits. It should have been routine, something she had done dozens of times before with excellent results. But as she demonstrated proper equipment handling, a sharp pain shot through her torso, causing her to drop a piece of gear and stumble backward. The recruits exchanged glances, and she could see the doubt creeping. into their expressions. These young soldiers needed confidence in their leaders, needed to believe that the people training them were strong and capable. Instead, they were watching her struggle with basic physical tasks. "Continue with the exercise," she managed to say to the supervising sergeant. "I need to step away for a moment." In the privacy of a supply closet, Sarah allowed herself a few minutes to deal with the wave of pain that had overwhelmed her. She had been rationing her medication carefully, trying to make it last longer, but the gaps between doses were becoming increasingly difficult to endure. When she emerged, she found Commander Roberts standing nearby, having obviously witnessed her abrupt departure from the training session. His expression was a mixture of irritation and what might have been concern, though with him it was always hard to tell. "Lieutenant Chen, a word," he said curtly. They walked to a quiet corner of the training facility, away from the recruits and other personnel. The commander's jaw was set in that familiar line that indicated he was struggling to control his temper. "What exactly was that display back there?" he demanded. "Those recruits need to see strength and competence from their officers, not someone who can't even handle basic equipment demonstrations." Sarah straightened her shoulders, trying to project confidence despite the pain that was still radiating through her body. "Sir, I apologize for the interruption to the training. It won't happen again." "You're damn right it won't happen again," Roberts shot back. "Because if it does, you'll be reassigned so fast your head will spin. I gave you 30 days to improve, Chen, and instead you seem to be getting worse." The commander stepped closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I've been watching you, Lieutenant. The way you move, the way you're always bundled up in that coat, the medical visits, the declining performance. If you're dealing with some kind of substance abuse problem, you need to get help now before it destroys your career and puts other soldiers at risk." The accusation was so far from the truth that Sarah almost laughed, but the sound that came out was more like a sob. Substance abuse. If only it were that simple. If only there were a support group she could join, a clear path to recovery, a problem that people would understand and rally around. "Sir, I can assure you that's not the issue," she said, her voice barely steady. "Then what is it?" Roberts demanded. "Because right now all I see is an officer who's falling apart and won't. Tell me why. Do you understand how that looks? Do you understand what kind of position that puts me in?" Sarah felt tears threatening and blinked them back aggressively. Crying in front of the commander would be the final nail in the coffin of her military career. She needed to find a way to buy more time, to figure out how to function well enough to keep her job while dealing with everything else. "I understand your position, sir," she said carefully. "I'm working on resolving the issues that have been affecting my performance. I just need a little more time." Commander Roberts studied her face intently, and for a moment she thought she saw something soften in his expression. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the familiar stern mask of military authority. "Time is a luxury we don't have in the Army, Lieutenant. Every day you're operating at less than full capacity is a day you're potentially putting lives at risk. Your squad, your fellow officers, the recruits you're supposed to be training, they all depend on you to be at your best." The weight of that responsibility had been crushing Sarah for weeks now. She knew exactly what was at stake, knew that her struggles weren't just affecting her own career but potentially compromising the safety and effectiveness of everyone around her. The guilt was almost worse than the physical pain. "I'm doing everything I can, sir," she said. And it was true. She was pushing herself beyond what should have been possible, using every ounce of strength and determination she had left. But as she walked away from yet another confrontation with her commanding officer, Sarah realized that everything she could do might not be enough. The emergency call came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. That had already been one of Sarah's worst days. She had barely managed to complete her duties, relying heavily on medication, just to remain upright during an important briefing. Now lying in her narrow apartment bed and finally allowing herself to acknowledge the full extent of her pain, the shrill ring of her military phone cut through the darkness. "Lieutenant Chen, we need you at the base immediately," came the voice of the duty officer. "We've got a situation that requires your expertise." Sarah struggled to sit up. every movement sending sharp jolts through her torso. "What kind of situation, sir?" "Multiple casualties from a training accident. The medical team needs all available officers to coordinate evacuation and family notifications. Your experience with crisis management makes you essential personnel for this operation." The irony wasn't lost on her. The same leadership skills that the commander had been questioning for weeks were now desperately needed in a real emergency. Sarah forced herself out of bed, moving through her apartment like an old woman despite being only 26 years old. Getting dressed took nearly 20 minutes, twice as long as usual. Each piece of her uniform felt impossibly heavy, and the act of pulling on her boots left her gasping for breath. But there were soldiers who needed help, families who would soon receive devastating news, and a complex emergency response that required coordination. She arrived at the base to find controlled chaos. Emergency vehicles filled the parking area, their red and blue lights casting eerie shadows across the buildings. The training accident had involved an explosive device malfunction during a night exercise, resulting in 3 fatalities and 7 serious injuries. Commander Roberts was in the command center, coordinating multiple aspects of the response simultaneously. When he saw Sarah enter, his expression showed both relief and surprise. Despite their recent conflicts, he knew she was one of his most capable officers in crisis situations. "Chen, I need you to handle the family notifications for the casualties," he said without preamble. "Work with Chaplain Morrison and the casualty assistance officers. Your attention to detail and communication skills make you the best choice for this responsibility." Sarah nodded, accepting the assignment that was both an honor and a tremendous burden. Notifying families of military casualties was one of the most difficult and important duties an officer could perform. It required compassion, precision, and emotional strength, qualities that she wasn't sure she still possessed in her current state. The next 18 hours blurred together in a haze of carefully controlled activity. Sarah coordinated with multiple agencies, ensured that proper protocols were followed for each family notification, and supervised the complex logistics of managing a tragedy that would impact the entire base community. Despite her physical struggles, her professional instincts took over. She moved efficiently from task to task, made critical decisions with clarity and confidence, and provided steady leadership during the most chaotic parts of the crisis response. The pain medication she had been carefully rationing was forgotten as adrenaline and duty carried her through the emergency. But by the following evening, when the immediate crisis had passed and the base began returning to normal operations, Sarah's body finally rebelled against the extraordinary demands she had placed on it. She was in her office completing the final paperwork from the incident, when a wave of pain so intense it took her breath away crashed over her. She tried to stand and immediately collapsed back into her chair, her vision going dark around the edges. Sweat broke out across her forehead despite the cool air conditioning, and she realized with growing alarm that something was seriously wrong, more wrong than usual. Sergeant Torres found her there 20 minutes later, slumped over her desk and barely conscious. The paperwork she had been working on was scattered across the floor, and her carefully maintained composure had finally cracked completely. "Jesus, Chen, what's happening?" Torres said, kneeling beside her chair. "Should I call the medics?" "No," Sarah managed to whisper, though even speaking required tremendous effort. "Just help me get to my car. I can drive myself home." "Like hell you can," Torres said firmly. "You can barely sit up straight. I'm taking you to the base hospital right now." Sarah tried to protest, but the words wouldn't come. The fear that had been driving her for weeks, fear of discovery, fear of judgment, fear of losing everything she had worked for, was now overshadowed by a more immediate terror. Her body was shutting down, and she could no longer pretend otherwise. The base hospital emergency room was quiet at this hour, staffed by a skeleton crew of medical personnel who were used to dealing with training injuries and routine military, medical issues. But when Torres helped Sarah through the doors, supporting most of her weight as she struggled to walk, the attending physician immediately recognized that this was something more serious. Dr. Rachel Martinez had been treating military personnel for 15 years, and she had developed an instinct for identifying soldiers who were hiding significant medical problems. Sarah's condition, The obvious pain, the careful way she moved, the pallor and exhaustion suggested something that had been developing for weeks or months. "Lieutenant, I need to examine you properly," Dr. Martinez said gently, guiding Sarah toward a private room. "Can you tell me what's been happening with your health recently?" For the first time in weeks, Sarah found herself face to face with someone who was asking the right questions for the right reasons. Dr. Martinez wasn't concerned about performance reports or military readiness. She was focused entirely on Sarah's well-being as a patient. "I've been having some health issues," Sarah admitted carefully. "I've been trying to manage them while maintaining my duties, but tonight something changed. The pain is different now, more intense." Dr. Martinez nodded knowingly. "How long have you been dealing with these health issues?" "About 3 months," Sarah said, then corrected herself. "Actually, longer than that. But they've gotten much worse in the past 3 months." As the doctor began her examination, Sarah realized that this moment had been inevitable. She had been living on borrowed time, pushing her body beyond its limits, while trying to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. But the crisis response of the past day had finally exposed the truth that she could no longer hide. Torres waited in the hallway outside, pacing nervously and checking his watch repeatedly. He had never seen Sarah in such a vulnerable state, and the contrast between her usual strength and competence and her current condition was deeply unsettling. Inside the examination room, Dr. Martinez was discovering the extent of what Sarah had been hiding from everyone, including herself. The physical evidence told a story of someone who had been fighting a serious battle while trying to maintain the demanding schedule and responsibilities of a military officer. "Lieutenant Chen," the doctor said quietly, "I need to ask you some very important questions, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Your health and your ability to continue serving depend on getting accurate information right now." Dr. Martinez closed the examination room door and pulled up a chair next to the bed where Sarah lay, still fully clothed in her military uniform. The doctor's expression was serious but kind, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt like she was in the presence of someone who might actually understand what she was going through. "Lieutenant, I've been practicing military medicine for a long time," Dr. Martinez began gently. "I've seen soldiers try to hide injuries, illnesses, and conditions because they're afraid of how it might affect their careers. But what I'm observing right now suggests something that goes far beyond normal military stoicism." Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the examination table. "Doctor, I need you to understand something. My commanding officer already thinks I'm weak, that I'm making excuses. If this gets into my medical record in a way that affects my fitness for duty rating—" "Let's focus on your health first," Dr. Martinez interrupted softly. "Everything else can be addressed once we understand what we're dealing with. But I need you to trust me enough to be completely honest about what's been happening to your body." The doctor's words broke through the wall of fear and denial that Sarah had been maintaining for so long. Slowly, hesitantly, she began to describe the symptoms that had been escalating over the past several months. The constant pain that started as occasional discomfort, but had grown into a relentless presence. The fatigue that no amount of sleep could address. The morning stiffness that made getting dressed an ordeal. The way her body seemed to be betraying her at every turn. "The pain isn't just in one place," Sarah explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "It moves around, but it's always there. Some days are better than others, but lately, there are no good days anymore. Just degrees of bad." Dr. Martinez listened carefully, taking notes and asking specific questions about the timeline, the nature of the pain, and the various symptoms Sarah had been experiencing. As the picture became clearer, the doctor's expression grew more concerned. "Lieutenant, I need to examine you properly, but that means you'll need to remove your uniform jacket and shirt. I know that might feel uncomfortable, but it's necessary for me to understand what we're dealing with." Sarah hesitated, her hands moving protectively to the buttons of her heavy coat. This was the moment she had been dreading most. The moment when someone else would see the physical evidence of what she had been hiding for so long. "Doctor, you have to understand," Sarah said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "If Commander Roberts finds out about this, if it goes in my record as a pre-existing condition or something that makes me unfit for duty. Sarah, Dr. Martinez said, using her first name for the first time. Whatever we discover here today, we'll figure out how to address it in a way that protects both your health and your career as much as possible. But I can't help you if I don't know what I'm dealing with. With shaking hands, Sarah began to unbutton her coat. Even this simple action was clearly difficult for her, and Dr. Martinez could see the careful, deliberate way she had to move to avoid triggering spasms of pain. When the coat came off, the doctor could see that Sarah's uniform shirt was hanging loose on her frame, evidence of significant weight loss. Removing the shirt revealed what Sarah had been hiding beneath the layers of clothing. Her torso was covered with a complex pattern of bruising in various stages of healing, some fresh and dark purple, others fading to yellow and green. But more shocking were the numerous small wounds and marks that suggested something far more serious than simple bruising. Dr. Martinez had seen many things in her medical career, but the sight of Sarah's injuries made her intake of breath audible in the quiet room. These weren't the kind of injuries that resulted from training accidents or normal military activities. They told a different story entirely. "Lieutenant," the doctor said carefully, "I need you to help me understand how these injuries occurred. Some of them appear to be quite recent, while others are clearly weeks or even months old." Sarah's composure finally cracked completely. The tears she had been holding back for months began to flow freely, and her entire body shook with suppressed sobs. This was the secret she had been carrying, the reason for her declining performance, the truth behind her careful layers of clothing and her desperate attempts to maintain normalcy. "It started about 6 months ago," Sarah whispered between sobs. "I was off base visiting my sister in the city. I was walking back to my car after dinner when someone attacked me. I thought it was just a random mugging at first." Dr. Martinez moved closer, her expression showing both professional concern and personal compassion. "Sarah, take your time. Tell me what you're comfortable sharing." "He had a knife," Sarah continued, the words coming out in a rush now that the dam had finally broken. "He cut me multiple times before I managed to get away. I drove myself to a civilian hospital, but I told them it was a training accident. I was afraid of how it would look on my record." The doctor nodded, understanding. Military personnel often worried about how civilian medical incidents might be interpreted by their commanding officers, especially incidents that suggested they had put themselves in dangerous situations during their personal time. The civilian doctors treated the immediate wounds, but some of them weren't healing properly. They kept reopening, getting infected, causing constant pain. "I've been trying to manage it with over-the-counter medication and antibiotics I bought online because I was afraid of coming to the base hospital." Dr. Martinez was horrified by what she was hearing. Not only had Sarah been dealing with the physical trauma of a violent attack, but she had been suffering in isolation, too afraid of professional consequences to seek proper medical care. The infected wounds and improper healing had created a cascade of health problems that had been getting progressively worse over time. "Sarah, listen to me," the doctor said firmly. "What happened to you was not your fault, and trying to hide these injuries has made them much worse than they needed to be. Some of these wounds show signs of serious infection, and your body has been fighting this battle for months without proper support." As Dr. Martinez continued her examination, the full extent of Sarah's condition became clear. The attack had left her with multiple deep lacerations, several of which had become chronically infected due to inadequate initial treatment and lack of follow-up care. Her immune system was compromised from months of fighting infection, which explained the constant fatigue and pain that had been affecting her military performance. "We need to admit you to the hospital immediately," Dr. Martinez said. "Some of these infections are serious enough that they could become life-threatening if not treated aggressively. You're going to need IV antibiotics, proper wound care, and possibly surgery to repair some of the damage." Sarah's eyes widened with panic. "Doctor, please, you don't understand. If I'm hospitalized, Commander Roberts will demand to know why. He already thinks I'm weak, that I'm making excuses. If he finds out I've been hiding a medical condition this serious, it will end my career." Dr. Martinez sat back in her chair, understanding the impossible position Sarah had put herself in. The lieutenant, had been trying to protect her military career by hiding a serious medical condition, but in doing so, she had allowed that condition to deteriorate to the point where it now posed an even greater threat to both her health and her professional future. "Sarah, we need to focus on saving your life right now," the doctor said gently but firmly. "Everything else, your career, your commander's opinion, your future in the military, all of that depends on getting you healthy first, and that means being honest about what you've been dealing with." The call came to Commander Roberts at 06:30 hours the next morning. He was in his kitchen drinking his first cup of coffee and reviewing the previous day's incident reports when his secure phone rang with the distinctive tone that indicated official business. "Commander, this is Dr. Martinez from the base hospital," came the voice on the other end. "I need to speak with you about Lieutenant Chen. She's been admitted under my care, and there are some things you need to know about her condition." Robert set down his coffee cup, his expression immediately shifting to one of concern mixed with frustration. "Doctor, if this is about some kind of stress-related condition or psychological evaluation, I want you to know that Lieutenant Chen has been underperforming for weeks. I've been trying to get to the bottom of whatever's been affecting her duty performance. Commander, I think you should come to the hospital," Dr. Martinez said carefully. "This isn't something we should discuss over the phone, and Lieutenant Chen has given me permission to share certain medical information with you that I believe will change your perspective on her recent performance issues." An hour later, Commander Roberts walked through the corridors of the base hospital with a mixture of impatience and growing unease. He had dealt with soldiers trying to avoid duty through medical claims before, and he was prepared to see through whatever elaborate story Lieutenant Chen and her doctor had concocted to excuse her recent failures. Dr. Martinez met him outside Sarah's room, her expression grave and professional. "Commander, before you see Lieutenant Chen, I need to prepare you for what you're going to learn. She's been dealing with a serious medical situation for months, and she's been trying to maintain her duties while fighting a battle that would have incapacitated most people. Doctor, with respect, I've heard every excuse imaginable from soldiers who can't handle the demands of military service," Roberts replied curtly. "If Lieutenant Chen has been dealing with some kind of medical condition, she should have reported it through proper channels instead of letting her performance deteriorate to the point where it affects unit readiness." Dr. Martinez studied the commander's face for a moment, recognizing the skepticism and irritation that she had seen from military leaders before when dealing with soldiers who seemed to be underperforming. "Commander, I want you to understand something before we go in there. Lieutenant Chen was the victim of a violent crime approximately 6 months ago. She sustained multiple serious injuries that became infected and have been causing her constant pain and disability since that time." Robert's expression shifted slightly, but his voice remained stern. "If she was the victim of a crime, why wasn't it reported through proper channels? Why wasn't I informed so that appropriate support could be provided?" "Because she was afraid," Dr. Martinez said simply. "She was afraid of being seen as weak, afraid of being judged, afraid of losing the career she had worked so hard to build. So she tried to handle it alone, and in the process she made her condition much worse." The doctor led Roberts into the hospital room where Sarah lay connected to IV lines and monitoring equipment. Even with professional medical care, she looked fragile and exhausted in a way that was shocking to see in someone who had always projected strength and competence. Sarah's eyes opened when she heard footsteps entering the room. When she saw Commander Roberts, her first instinct was to try to sit up straighter, to maintain some semblance of military bearing even in her hospital bed. But the movement caused visible pain, and she sank back against the pillows with a soft gasp. "Lieutenant," Roberts said, his voice carefully controlled but noticeably different from the harsh tone he had been using with her recently. "Dr. Martinez tells me you've been dealing with some serious medical issues." Sarah looked between the commander and the doctor, unsure of how much had been revealed and what Roberts was thinking. "Sir, I want you to know that I never intended for my personal situation to affect my duty performance. I was trying to handle it privately so that it wouldn't impact the unit." Dr. Martinez moved to Sarah's bedside and began to carefully remove the hospital gown to reveal the extent of her injuries. "Commander, I think you need to see what Lieutenant Chen has been dealing with while trying to maintain her full-duty schedule." What Roberts saw made him step backward involuntarily. The eye, pattern of wounds and scars across Sarah's torso, told a story of violence and trauma that was far beyond anything he had imagined. Some of the wounds were still bandaged and obviously receiving active medical treatment, while others showed the irregular healing patterns of injuries that had been inadequately treated for months. "Jesus Christ," Roberts whispered, his military composure cracking for the first time in years. "Lieutenant, what happened to you?" Sarah's voice was barely audible as she began to explain the attack, the initial treatment at the civilian hospital, and her decision to hide the extent of her injuries from the military medical system. As she spoke, Roberts found himself reconstructing the past several months from an entirely different perspective. The declining physical performance that he had attributed to laziness or lack of motivation now made sense in the context of someone dealing with chronic pain and infection. The medical visits that he had suspected were attempts to build a case for disability discharge were actually desperate attempts by Sarah to manage her condition while remaining on duty. The heavy coat that had seemed like an affectation or attempt to hide weight gain was actually concealing wounds that would have shocked anyone who saw them. The distracted behavior and decreased focus that had frustrated him so much were the natural result of someone fighting a constant battle with pain while trying to maintain professional responsibilities. "Lieutenant Chen," Roberts said, pulling up a chair next to her bed, "why didn't you tell me what was really going on? Why did you let me think you were just having performance problems when you were dealing with something like this?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Sir, I was afraid you would think I was weak. I was afraid of being seen as damaged goods, as someone who couldn't handle the demands of military service. I worked so hard to get where I am, and I was terrified of losing it all because of something that happened to me during my personal time." Dr. Martinez added, "Commander, Lieutenant Chen has been functioning with a level of pain and disability that would have most people completely incapacitated. The fact that she maintained any level of performance while dealing with multiple infected wounds and compromised immune function is actually remarkable." Roberts sat in stunned silence for several moments, processing everything he had learned. The woman lying in the hospital bed before him wasn't the weak, excuse-making soldier he had believed her to be. She was someone who had been fighting an extraordinary battle while trying to maintain her responsibilities and protect her career. "Sir," Sarah said quietly, "I know I should have been honest about my condition from the beginning. I know I should have trusted the system and my chain of command to support me. But I've seen what happens to soldiers who are perceived as damaged or unreliable. I was afraid of becoming one of those cautionary tales." Roberts felt a weight settling in his chest as he realized how badly he had misjudged the situation. His years of experience dealing with soldiers who made excuses had made him cynical about any explanation that seemed to deflect responsibility. But Sarah hadn't been deflecting responsibility. She had been taking on far more responsibility than any person should have to bear alone. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice much gentler than it had been in months, "I owe you an apology. I should have recognized that something serious was happening instead of assuming you were just another soldier who couldn't handle the pressure." Dr. Martinez continued her explanation of Sarah's condition. "The infections have been systemic, affecting her entire body's ability to function normally. She's been experiencing constant pain, chronic fatigue, and cognitive effects from both the physical trauma and the medications she's been using to try to manage her symptoms." Roberts looked at Sarah with new eyes, seeing not the failing officer he had been so frustrated with, but a soldier who had been displaying extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances. "Doctor, what's the prognosis? What kind of treatment does she need, and what does this mean for her military career?" "With proper medical treatment, most of these issues are treatable," Dr. Martinez replied. "She'll need several weeks of intensive antibiotic therapy, some surgical procedures to repair the poorly healed wounds, and extensive physical therapy. But there's no reason why she can't make a full recovery and return to active duty." Sarah's eyes widened with hope and disbelief. "Doctor, are you saying that I might be able to continue my military career? That this doesn't have to end everything I've worked for?" Not only can you continue your career, Roberts interjected, but when you're ready to return to duty, you'll be returning as an officer who has demonstrated incredible dedication and resilience. What you've been through, what you've survived, while maintaining your responsibilities, that's not weakness, Lieutenant. That's strength of a kind I've rarely seen. 3 months later, Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood in Commander Roberts' office once again, but everything about the moment was different from their previous encounters. She wore her uniform with confidence, no longer hiding beneath layers of heavy clothing. Her posture was straight and strong, her eyes bright with the clarity that comes from proper rest and healing. The medical treatment had been extensive but successful. The infected wounds had finally healed properly under Dr. Martinez's careful supervision. The antibiotics had cleared the systemic infection that had been poisoning her body for months. Physical therapy had restored her strength and mobility to levels that exceeded even her pre-incident capabilities. But more importantly, Sarah had learned to accept help and support from others. Sergeant Torres had visited her almost daily during her hospitalization, bringing books and news from the base. Other officers had stopped by to offer encouragement and share their own stories of overcoming difficult challenges. The military community that she had feared would reject her had instead embraced her with understanding and respect. Commander Roberts looked up as she entered his office, and his expression immediately reflected the profound change in her appearance and demeanor. "Lieutenant Chen, please have a seat. I've been looking forward to this conversation." Sarah settled into the chair across from his desk, no longer afraid of what he might say or demand of her. The fear that had dominated her life for so many months had been replaced by a quiet confidence built on honesty and proper support. "Sir, I want to thank you for everything you've done during my recovery," she began. "I know my situation created challenges for the unit, and I appreciate how supportive you've been throughout this process." Roberts leaned back in his chair, studying her face with something approaching amazement. "Lieutenant, I have to admit that I've learned as much from this experience as you have. Your situation taught me that sometimes what looks like failure is actually extraordinary courage, and that the strongest soldiers are often the ones who are fighting battles nobody else can see." The commander pulled out a folder from his desk drawer and placed it in front of him. "I have some news that I think you'll want to hear. First, Dr. Martinez has cleared you for full active duty with no restrictions. Your medical evaluation shows that you've not only recovered completely, but that you're actually in better physical condition now than you were before the incident." Sarah felt a surge of relief and pride. The months of proper medical treatment and rehabilitation had indeed restored her to full health. But more than that, they had given her a new appreciation for what her body could accomplish when properly cared for. "Second," Roberts continued, "I've submitted a commendation letter for your personnel file regarding your performance during the training accident crisis. The way you handled those family notifications and coordinated the emergency response while dealing with your own medical situation, that level of professionalism and dedication deserves formal recognition." The news was more than Sarah had dared to hope for. Instead of the negative performance reviews and disciplinary actions she had feared for so long, she was receiving recognition for her service during one of the most difficult periods of her life. "But there's something else," Roberts said, his expression becoming more serious. "I've also submitted a recommendation for you to attend the Advanced Leadership course at Fort Leavenworth. Your experience, your resilience, and the wisdom you've gained from overcoming this situation make you exactly the kind of officer the Army needs in leadership positions." Sarah's eyes widened in shock. The Advanced Leadership course was highly competitive and reserved for officers who were being groomed for significant command responsibilities. It represented not just career advancement, but a clear signal that her superiors saw her as having exceptional potential. "Sir, I don't know what to say," she managed. "After everything that's happened, after all the problems I caused." "You didn't cause problems, Lieutenant," Roberts interrupted firmly. "You survived a traumatic experience and continued to serve while dealing with challenges that would have broken most people. That's not a liability. That's an asset. The Army needs leaders who understand adversity and know how to overcome it." As they continued their conversation, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed over the past few months. The attack that had seemed like it might end her military career had instead become a catalyst for personal growth and professional recognition. The fear and shame that had nearly destroyed her had been replaced by confidence and purpose. "There's one more thing I want to discuss," Robert said. "Dr. Martinez and I have been talking about developing a program to help other soldiers who might be dealing with similar situations. We think your experience could be valuable in helping other service members understand that seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness." The idea resonated deeply with Sarah. She thought about all the months she had suffered in silence, afraid to trust the very system that had ultimately supported and healed her. If her story could help even one other soldier avoid that unnecessary pain and fear, it would give additional meaning to everything she had endured. "I'd be honored to participate in something like that," she said. "I know now that I could have avoided months of suffering if I had been brave enough to ask for help sooner." Sergeant Torres knocked on the office door and was invited in to join their conversation. He had been instrumental in Sarah's recovery, providing both practical support and emotional encouragement throughout her treatment. His friendship had been one of the constants that helped her maintain hope during the darkest periods. "Chen, you ready for tomorrow's training exercise?" Torres asked with a grin. "I hear you're leading the advanced tactical scenario," Sarah smiled back, feeling a genuine excitement about returning to the challenging and rewarding work she loved. "More than ready, Torres. I'm looking forward to getting back to what I do best." As the meeting concluded and Sarah prepared to leave the commander's office, Robert stood up and extended his hand to her. "Lieutenant Chen, I want you to know that you've changed how I think about leadership and strength. Your courage in facing this situation, both the initial trauma and the difficult process of healing, has been an inspiration to everyone who knows your story." Sarah shook his hand firmly, meeting his eyes with confidence and gratitude. "Thank you, sir, for everything, for giving me the chance to prove that asking for help doesn't make someone weak, and for showing me that the military can be a place where people support each other through the most difficult challenges." Walking out of the commander's office, and across the base where she had once felt so isolated and afraid, Sarah felt a profound sense of belonging and purpose. The wounds hidden beneath her coat had finally healed, but more importantly, she had learned that true strength comes not from suffering in silence, but from having the courage to trust others with your vulnerability and pain.